The New Norm is brought to you by Winning at Home. I'm Steve Norman. Welcome to The New Norm. So just recently we celebrated Easter, and Easter is just a great chance for us to reflect on the center point of all of Christian history, which is the cross of Jesus Christ. And one of the episodes that tees up the cross, that points to the cross, that anticipates the cross, is a really pivotal scene in the life of Abraham. If you're not familiar with Abraham, he's kind of the central character of the book of Genesis. He's 75 years old when God calls him and promises to make him a great nation. So Abraham, when he gets that call, leaves the only land that he knows. And when he gets to this new land, the land of Canaan, it will be later known as the Promised Land, God says, "To your offspring I will give this land." And after a brief stay in Egypt, Abraham lands in a different part of the Promised Land called Hebron. And when he arrives there, God says, "Your heir will be your own flesh and blood." So 10 years later, Sarah, Abram's wife, is tired of waiting for them to have a child of their own, and she concocts a plan that she give her Egyptian servant, a young woman by the name of Hagar, to be Abraham's second wife so that she can bear their child. Kind of like a surrogate situation. And when Abraham is 86, that child, Ishmael, is born. And we like to think that everything is good, except that it's not. The arrival of Ishmael brings a lot of tension and animosity between Sarah and Hagar. So finally, 14 years later, Sarah, at age 90, miraculously gives birth to a son by the name of Isaac. So the promised son arrives 25 years later. And this is where we pick up a really wild story. Genesis chapter 22. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, "Abraham, here am I," he replied. Then God said, "Take your son, your only son, whom you love," which is interesting because if you remember the scene where Jesus is baptized, that's a phrase that we hear, "This is my son whom I love. This is my son whom I delight in." Similar verbiage that God uses to describe Abraham's son Isaac. "Take that son, Isaac, go to the region of Moriah, sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you." Early the next morning, Abraham got up and loaded his donkey. He took with him two of his servants and his son Isaac. And when he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. And on the third day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. He said to his servants, "Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship and then we'll come back to you." Let's stop here. There are three moments in these verses that don't make any sense at all. The first one is God's ask, "Take your son whom you love and sacrifice him as a burnt offering." Here's what we already know about Abraham. He is a consistent worshiper of God. When God appeared to him years ago, he built an altar by this place called the Great Tree at Shechem. And we moved to a different location, Bethel, he built an altar. When he and Lot part ways and he relocates to Hebron, he built an altar. In Genesis 15, God asks him to sacrifice animals as an act of worship. More specifically, a heifer, a goat, and a ram, each 3 years old, along with a dove and a young pigeon. So it is not uncommon for A, Abraham to make offerings, and B, God to ask for an animal sacrifice. But there has never been any hint that God would ask Abraham to sacrifice a person. And from Abraham's perspective, after all he went through to get Isaac, sacrificing him doesn't make any sense at all. Which brings us to our second nonsensical point in this passage, which is Abraham's response, which says, "Early the next morning, Abraham got up and loaded his donkey." Abraham doesn't flinch. He makes preparations for the trip. He gathers two staff members. He collects Isaac. He cuts some wood and starts walking. Now, for as insane as this is, it reflects Abraham's total commitment to surrender. Early in his story, God asks him to leave his hometown for Canaan, sight unseen, and he does. God says, "Surrender your comfort." And Abraham says, "Yes, Lord." Later, God asks for an animal sacrifice. And Abraham offers it. It's as if God is saying, "Sacrifice your possessions, sacrifice your stuff." And Abraham says, "Yes, Lord." Later, God asks Abraham to get circumcised as an act of obedience. And Abraham does it. God says, sacrifice your body. And Abraham says, yes, Lord. And now God asks him to sacrifice his son, his only son, whom he loves. God says, Abraham, surrender your son. And Abraham says, yes, Lord. That's a long walk. The four of them travel for 2 whole days. And then on that third day, Abraham and Isaac leave the servants behind and keep walking. What do you suppose that was like? What do they talk about on that day? So God's ask doesn't make any sense. Abraham's response doesn't make any sense. And then Abraham's promise doesn't make any sense. In verse 4, he tells the servants when they part ways, he and Isaac, we will worship and then we will come back to you. We will worship and we will return. So either Abraham is lying because he knows that he's coming back alone and he doesn't want to alarm Isaac, or Abraham believes that somehow, some way, God is going to intervene for them and they're going to come back together. Verse 6, Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife, and the 2 of them went on together. And Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, Father. Yes, my son, Abraham replied. The fire and wood are here, Isaac said, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Abraham answered, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. And the 2 of them went on together. This is the moment of truth. Abraham takes the wood for the offering and puts it on his son. Isaac has seen sacrifice before, and he's old enough to know that it always includes a lamb. So it was entirely reasonable for him to ask, where is it? And Abraham says, God is going to provide a lamb for the offering. So again, either Abraham is lying to protect Isaac, or he believes that God is going to pull victory from the edge of tragedy. Verse 9, when they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it, and he bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Now, it's important to remember that while the English translation of the word here is boy, later in the book of Genesis, that same word, boy, is used to describe a young man of marriageable age. So boy has a lot of flexibility in age range. So Abraham's son, Isaac, could be 6, or he very well could be 18, 19, 20 years old. So if he's older, and Abraham, who is 100 years old, bound him and laid him on the altar, it means that Isaac is a bewildered and yet willing participant in this scene. When Isaac is on top of the altar, Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son, but the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, Abraham, Abraham. Here I am, he replied. Do not lay a hand on the boy. He said, do not do anything to him. Another way to translate that is don't harm him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son. And Abraham looked up, and there in a thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. So he went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, the Lord will provide. And to this day it said that on the mountain of the Lord it will be provided. The angel of the Lord called to Abraham from heaven a second time and said, I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of the enemies, and through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed because you have obeyed me. So God honors Abraham's obedience with a promise. Through your offspring, through your descendants, through your heirs, all nations on earth will be blessed. And again, nations doesn't mean countries. It means people groups, tribes, ethnicities. Now, if we fast forward to Hebrews chapter 11, we read this about Abraham. By faith, Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who had embraced the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son, even though God had said to him, it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. the text says, Abraham reasoned that God could even raise the dead, and so, in a manner of speaking, he did receive Isaac back from the dead. Did you catch that line? Abraham reasoned that God could even raise the dead. And in Isaac's case, figuratively, he did. God intervened on Isaac's behalf because he never wanted him to die. In providing the lamb, God provides a substitute for Isaac. Now, Mount Moriah, the site of this sacrifice, was so central to the Jewish story that Solomon, hundreds of years later, built his glorious temple on that site. So over the centuries, thousands of sheep are offered there so that people can be forgiven of their sins before God. And approximately 2,000 years after Isaac, Jesus comes to Jerusalem. So Abraham travels to Mount Moriah to make a sacrifice. And Jesus walks to Mount Moriah, also known as Mount Zion, to become the sacrifice. Abraham took the wood and put it on his son. Jesus takes the wood of the cross and puts it on himself. Abraham found a ram as a substitute offering. It dies in Isaac's place. Jesus volunteers to be our substitute offering. He dies in our place. Abraham's offspring becomes a blessing. Abraham is blessed through Isaac. But Jesus is Abraham's ultimate offspring. Abraham has no greater descendant than Christ, and all nations are blessed through him. Every single person over the course of human history has the opportunity to be restored to right relationship to God through the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. But on that very first Good Friday, Jesus wasn't a generic substitute. He was a very specific one. This last week, I've been reading through the book of Luke and was stunned by what I read in Luke chapter 23. Pilate, the Roman governor, called together the chief priests, the rulers, and the people and said to them, "You brought me this man, Jesus, as one who is inciting the people to rebellion. I have examined him in your presence and have found no basis for your charges against him. Neither has Herod, for he sent him back to us. As you can see, he has done nothing to deserve death. Therefore, I will punish him and then release him." But the whole crowd shouted, "Away with this man! Release Barabbas to us." Barabbas had been thrown into prison for an insurrection in the city and for murder. And wanting to release Jesus, Pilate appealed to them again, but they kept shouting, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Now, we don't know a lot about Barabbas. He was a revolutionary. He was a zealot who incited rebellion and committed murder in that act. He was slated to be executed by the Romans as an example to others who might think about stirring up trouble. He was a criminal who deserved to die for his act of violence. But Jesus is the ram in the thicket for Barabbas. His appearance means that Barabbas doesn't have to die, even though he deserves to. And later in Luke 23, we read two other men, both criminals. And again, these likely weren't petty thieves. They were violent criminals who were also let out with him to be executed. And when they came to the place of the skull, they crucified him, meaning Jesus there, along with the criminals, one on his right and the other on his left. And Jesus said, "Father, forgive them. They don't even know what they are doing." And they divided up his clothes by casting lots. There were three men who were slated for execution that day, but one of them gets a reprieve. And Jesus died on the cross that was supposed to be for Barabbas. And Jesus dies on the cross that was supposed to be for you and for me as well. And as a blessing to the nations, he dies for the people like you and me and dies for the people who aren't anything like us. Why? Because his death is a blessing not just for some, but for all. So if today, maybe you missed a moment of reflection at Easter, know this: Jesus is the ram in the thicket for you. Jesus picks up the cross that had your name on it, because the truth is you and I deserve to suffer the consequences for the crimes that we committed against God, ourselves, and others. But in his act of unflagging love and boundless mercy, Jesus lays down his life so that you and I could be forgiven, redeemed, and restored. And that, my friends, that's the good news. The New Norm is produced and distributed by Winning at Home. Winning at Home is a faith-based nonprofit committed to making individuals, couples, families, and businesses stronger through counseling and coaching. And if you're encouraged by these podcasts and you're excited about the mission of Winning at Home, I would encourage you to go to winningathome.com to learn more about our mission. And if you want to support that financially, there's an opportunity for you to do that as well. Again, I'm your host, Steve Norman. Thanks for listening.